How you doing?
You know, yeah. Some of the ones we haven't been to. But that one, it was like, what was exciting for me? That's, yeah. I mean, I would get pictures and show.
Do you have anybody up in Hillsborough?
No, I love to tell those stories.
Tony, pleased to meet you, sir. I'm the one that keeps them from being good evil trees.
Hey Gary, how you doing?
That's easy. I've got about 2 minutes to get up. Did you find?
Yeah, because when I read, you had to have like the caption, so we'll have to see if it works. And actually,
I bet you they got a lot of,
yeah, because when I read it, I
on
was
the
like,
beach from that surge.
it was wanting some stuff, but I said it, so.
Good deal.
That's what I heard. Yeah.
Alrighty, let's grab a hymn book. Oh, how I love Jesus. 146. Got a little hot on this microphone.
There are two.
146. 146. Let's stand together. Oh, how I love Jesus. We're glad you're here tonight. Brother Perry's going to lay it out here in a minute. 146. Right. 146. That's wrong one. That's not the one I want to do. Oh, how I love Jesus. Oh, how I love Jesus. Oh, it's under a different name. There is a name. I know it. 217. 217. And all this is out on the internet. That would make me look good. 217. There is a name I love to hear, I love to sing its word. It sounds like music in my ear, the sweetest name on earth. Oh, how I love Jesus. Oh, how I love Jesus. Oh, how I love Jesus. Because
Tim. Phil. No, your name is Phil. But your guest is Tony.
Tony.
We're glad to have you here with us, man, Tony. Welcome. You all be seated. Brother Perry's going to come up here.
Oh, I'm glad you're here. Tony, I'm glad you're here. We got that all figured out. Yeah. Who's on first? I thought. I'm glad all y'all are here. Boy, this section over here is just almost not quite full. They're doing good over there. Doing good. We're going to look at chapter 37 tonight. It's a pretty short chapter. It'll go fairly quickly. We may get through a little earlier, but we could not start chapter 38 and not finish it. And so that's the reason for that. This chapter begins the transition in the book of Genesis. From here to the end of the book, it's the story of how God's people have been preserved, and it's a beautiful, beautiful story. I found this little thing someone wrote a long time ago, and I copied it on my phone. I want to read it to you before we start. You will see this through the next weeks of study and the story of how Joseph, the plan of God through Joseph. Listen to this. I thought it was pretty good about God's plan. If his family wasn't messed up and weird, his brothers would have never sold him as a slave. If his brother never sold him as a slave, then he'd have never gone to Egypt. If he had never gone to Egypt, he would never have been sold to Potiphar. If he had never been sold to Potiphar, then he would not escape from the temptation of his wife falsely accusing him. If she hadn't falsely accused him, he'd have never been put in prison. If he hadn't been put in prison, he'd never met the baker and the butler of Pharaoh. And if he hadn't met the baker and the butler of Pharaoh, he'd have never interpreted their dreams. If Joseph had never interpreted their dreams, he'd have never interpreted Pharaoh's dream. If he'd have never interpreted Pharaoh's dream, he would never have become prime minister, second only to Pharaoh in Egypt. If he had never become prime minister, he had not been wisely prepared for the terrible famine to come. If Joseph never wisely prepared for the terrible famine, then his family back in Canaan would have died in the famine. If Joseph's family back in Canaan had died, then the Messiah would not have come from a dead family. If the Messiah had never come, then we're all dead in our sins and without hope in this world. Aren't we grateful for God's great plan? Isn't that amazing? I don't know who wrote it. It was not attributed to anyone. I got it from David Gusick's website, but it's just amazing. And that's what we're going to start with tonight. There are so many little vignettes in this one chapter, and I don't want to chase any rabbits, but I want you to see in your own life, in the lives of people that you've known, how some of these things creep into our lives and how they affect us. So let's look at what it says here. Verse 1. Now Jacob dwelt in the land where his father was a stranger. Your Bible may say sojourner. That means a person really is just visiting there. They don't own anything. They're just there. This is a history of Jacob. This is a history of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brothers. Now, he was about 6 years old when they left Haran and ended up in the other side of the Jordan River from Canaan. And they stayed in that region after they crossed the Jordan about 10 years or so, 10 or 11 years. And so when we pick the story up now, he is 17 years old. Now, they have gone down toward Hebron, out of Bethel, and they're living there. Now, he's feeding the flock with his brothers. Now, very interesting here, the next part. And the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah. Now, you know the significance of that? These were not Jacob's wives. Rachel and Leah were his wives. These were basically concubines. Now, you could consider them wives. You could say he had 4 wives. He had children by these 2. But the reason I bring that up is he was very, very much separated from them in his heritage. He could look at Leah being his father's other wife, and I don't know what he would call her, but these 2 women were basically concubines. They were handmaids of Rachel and
Leah. And so the separation between their sons and him would be greater than the separation between Joseph and his half-brothers from Leah. I hope I made that clear. This is why the writer put this in here this way. These were the boys that he was with out there. And look at what the latter part of that verse says. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to his father. What do you think about that? A bad report. Why would he give a bad report? Were they slacking in their job? Were they not taking care of the flocks as they should have? Were they making fun of Jacob? Were they being lewd and lascivious in their speech? I have no idea. And then also think of this. Why would Joseph bring that back and tell his father? Have you ever had this situation arise in your life about where you knew something that should have been revealed perhaps, and you had that question come up, should I say something? You ever had that happen? Ooh, isn't that a touchy situation? And then that thing comes up, none your business. None your business. Just pull legal beef, let it alone. But then you think, how much harm and hurt could happen if I don't say something? If I don't say something, what could happen to this family? What could happen to this company? What could happen to a friendship if I withhold this information? And yet, if I divulge this information, what are all the ramifications of that? What kind of light is it going to put me in? Apparently, God's Word doesn't fill in all those things that come to our mind, but Joseph just went and told his dad that something was going on, a bad report. Now, notice something else curious in the next verse. The writer refers to Jacob as Israel. You remember I mentioned a couple of weeks ago that as he went on through life, his name Israel became more and more used, and the word Jacob became less used. Usually when Jacob was used, it indicates the man that was acting like he used to act, and Israel when he acted better. But anyway, it says, now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age. Now, that son of his old age could also, you could say he was the son of when he was an older man. He had this son. He also had Benjamin, didn't he? Benjamin was younger than Joseph. But Joseph was the firstborn from Rachel, and he loved him. Now, what's wrong with loving one of your kids more than the others? Oh, that's a big one. Some of you have been in here when I've taught this before, and I'm not going to tell it. It's a great story. It's a real story about somebody that I know very well, still do, that was very much looked down upon by his father in relation to his sister. Father loved the sister, didn't pay much attention to the boy, and it shows in life today. But you've seen this. You've seen this. You can have a scenario where someone say they have two sons, and the older one perhaps takes a wrong path. Maybe when they become a teenager, they get in trouble, have 2 or 3 car wrecks, and they get to maybe using drugs, this, that, and the other, maybe stealing from dad or whatever. And then this younger one seems like he do no wrong. Studies well in school, very polite, just an upstanding citizen. It's very difficult for a parent to not pay more attention to that child and not care for them more. That's human nature. But here, we're going to see in a moment, it's born out in a very overt way. He loved him because he was a son of his old age, as he advanced in years. Also, he made him a tunic of many colors. Now, I've done a lot of study about that. That was not unusual. I used to think when I was a little kid that Joseph was the only person in the whole world that ever had a coat of many colors, but that was very common. It signified when a man had numerous children, usually the elder son would get this tunic. And where most of the tunics would come just at or below the knee, it was an outer garment. And they were adorned with various things on them. Usually this type tunic went all the way to the ankles. And so if someone were to see a young man walking down the street wearing a tunic like that, they would say, oh yeah, that's Jacob's boy. And he's way up on the totem pole. He's way up there. Now that should have been firstborn, but it was not. It was Joseph, next to lastborn, next to last in age. He made him this tunic of many colors. It was very much, very obvious when you would see it. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, now we include all of them, not just these ones that were from the handmaidens that he had problems with out with the sheep. They hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. You know what God's Word says about hate? Jesus dealt with this specifically in the Sermon on the Mount. And this is something that the world out there that we try to witness to has a great deal of problem understanding. Jesus said if you hate your brother, in God's eyes it's the same as if you took his life. Just like if you lust after a woman, it's the same as having committed adultery with her. And so this word is a grievous word. When I was a little boy, I let fly with that word a time or two in relation to things, and I was corrected very quickly. Maybe you were too, I don't know. But I was told that you don't say that word. In fact, growing up in a Baptist home, I was taught that the only thing you hate is sin and the devil. You don't say, oh, I hate chocolate ice cream. No, you just don't use that word. That's a very harsh word. It is a word of desecration, a word of doing away with something. They hated him, and they could not speak peaceably to him. What did Paul say about living in peace with people? As much as you can, live peaceably among men. Live in peace with them. As much as you can. That's kind of a qualifier. Sometimes people push our buttons, and it's hard to live peaceably among them, isn't it? But these men hated him. Now the next part, I don't have a lot of answers to. Why in the world would Joseph, he obviously knows, he's 17 years old, he obviously knows they don't like him. I mean, it's obvious the way they treat him. They do not like him. Can you tell when someone doesn't like you? You can tell when I don't like you. I guarantee you that. But anyway, why would he do what he's about to do? Look at verse 5. He had a dream, and he told it to his brothers. And they hated him even more. I reckon so. Look what his dream was. Please hear this dream which I've dreamed. There we were binding sheaves in the field. How many of y'all know what that is? Don't raise your hand. Very few of you probably do. They would cut their grain. You know that. They would cut their grain. And as they would cut it with the sickle or the scythe, and it would lay over, some would come behind and they would bundle it up. They'd wrap it up in these little wads. They'd use something like what we would call binder twine. They probably use some kind of natural vine, and they would twist it up and tie it. And then some others would come behind, and the grain was still down, but they would take it and they'd stand them up and make shocks out of it where the grain could dry, air could go through it. And so these boys are out there doing farm work. They're harvesting the grain. They're out in the fields, binding up the grain. Then behold, my sheaf arose and also stood upright, and indeed your sheaves stood all around and bowed down to my sheaf. Now here these texts is in fighting words. I'm telling you, what you saying? You're better than we are. That your sheep stands up and ours has to bow. What in the world? It's a wonder a fight didn't break out right there in the field, and he's outnumbered 10-1, right? Why in the world would he bring that up? Well, it's part of the plan of God. If he did not, just from having favor of his father and having that tunic, have enough reason for them to dislike him and tattling on him, when they did this put them over the edge, as we'll see here in just a minute. And his brother said to him, shall you indeed reign over us, or shall you indeed have dominion over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Now this second dream is even worse, because now he's going to include his family, his father and his mother. He dreamed another dream, told his brother, and said, look, I've dreamed another dream. And this time the sun and the moon and the 11 stars bowed down to me. Now there's all kinds of theologians have come up with ideas about what sun, the moon, and stars are. I tell you what I think, it's mom and daddy and all the brothers is what I think. But you can, if there's some other thing that you think it could be, that's fine. But he's saying here, the whole bunch of you are going to bow down to me. And look at here what Jacob does. Jacob is a father that we've seen over and over, and we'll see it again, is somewhat like David was many years later, a little bit absent-minded and a little bit aloof and pulled back from his family. And he doesn't react and respond like a dad should. And that's a tough thing. And you know, this happens a lot in our world today. I was told a story here a week or two ago about a dad that had a son that went off somewhere way off gambling. And this is a true story. This just happened last week. And the boy lost all of his money gambling. And so he calls his daddy to get his daddy to wire him some money so he can come back home, drive back home from another state. And of course, daddy did it because he didn't want his boy to be over there and not get home. So someone else that knew about this, that knows this dad real well, said he does that over and over and over again. He indulges this boy. And this boy he's wrecked vehicles, he's been in jail, had to be bailed out, and every time dad calls, he gets all upset and they fuss and fight, but he always bails him out. So his dad sent him money so he could come back home. Now, Jacob is somewhat like that. He just pulls back. He's not as strong a dad, perhaps, as you and I would like for him to be. Look at verse 10. He told it to his father and his brother, and his father rebuked him. And he said to him, "What is this dream you've dreamed? Shall your mother and I and your brothers indeed come to bow down to the earth before you?" But look at verse 11. His brothers envied him, but his father kept the matter in mind. He didn't act. He just kept it in mind. What was this boy talking about? So it gives Jacob something to think about. You remember, there may be some of you here that were not here when I talked about envy, how bad it is. Jealousy and envy are different things. They feed off one another. Jealousy is you wanting something someone else has. Envy is you wish they didn't have what they have. And so envy is a much more devious sin. Much more devious. And they envied him. Now, let's see what happens to him.
Yeah.
Then his brothers
That's the video.
went to feed their flock in Shechem. Now, they were down in Hebron, down below Bethel, and it's about 60, 70 miles up to Shechem. So these animals have traveled quite a ways. They probably grazed and fed along that way. But to get enough grass to eat, they had gone quite a ways from where Jacob lived. And Israel, see, again, we use his name here, said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers feeding the flock in Shechem? Come, I'll send you to them." And so he said to him, "Here am I." See, he's an obedient son. He's a good boy. He's a good boy. Then he said to him, "Please go and see if it's well with your brothers and well with the flocks, and bring back word to me." So he sent him out to the valley of Hebron, and he went to Shechem. Now, he's probably afoot. He's probably walking. And he's gone up there. It's going to be at least a 2-day journey. And he's gotten up there, and there were no road signs particularly, no way of finding anybody. And so he gets where Shechem is, and he's wandering in a field. Look at verse 15. A certain man found him, and there he was wandering in a field. And the man asked him, saying, "What are you seeking?" And he said, "I'm seeking my brothers. Please tell me where they are feeding their flocks." And the man said, "They have departed from here. For I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them in Dothan. Now Dothan is mentioned in another place in the Bible later on during the books of the Kings. It is somewhere about 15 miles or so north or northwest of where Shechem was at that time. So now he's going to have to walk another half a day to find it. And when they saw him, here's where this plot thickens. When they saw him afar off, even before he came near them, they conspired against him to kill him. Now, how did they recognize him from afar off? He's wearing this ridiculous coat that Nobody else had one like it. They certainly didn't. And they look up and they see the code and they think, oh, here he comes. So now, they are 70-something miles away from Daddy. And very few people even know where they are. And it so happens that Dothan, and this is the way God works this out, Dothan, as opposed to Shechem, is right next to a major caravan track. This is part of history, not just biblical history. This is part of history. Folks that were coming from east of the Jordan River and crossing it, and they came right through Dothan, and they went down just inside that Mediterranean seaboard through the Gaza Strait there, and right on down and went into Egypt. And that will come into play here in a minute. So they saw him coming, and they conspired against him to kill him. Then they said one to another, look, this dreamer's coming. Come, therefore, let us now kill him and cast him into some pit, and we shall say, some wild beast has devoured him. We shall see what will become of his dreams. Now, they've got this plan all made out. Wouldn't this make a good movie? Oh, it'd be a great movie. But Reuben heard it. Now, what about Reuben? Reuben is, he should be the place of honor. He's way up the food chain. He's elder. He's a whole lot older than Joseph is. Reuben heard it, and he delivered him out of their hands and said, let us not kill him. And Reuben said to them, see, he's trying to exercise, as elder brother, he's trying to exercise some control over these men and let them think of what they're doing. Shed no blood, but cast him into this pit, which is in the wilderness, and do not lay a hand on him, that he might deliver him out of their hands and bring him back to the Father. Here's what Reuben's going to do. They're not going to stay there long. They're nomadic sheep herders. The herds will move along. This pit was probably a hand-dug cistern. They dug these oftentimes near these rocky stream beds, so when it would flood, then it would fill that thing up, and then when it got dry, there'd still be water there. When I first got married, we lived on her dad's place down close to Berkson, and there was an actual cistern on that place. And I was fascinated by it. It had a bunch of junk poured in it and everything, but you could look down in it, and it was like a big jug in the dirt. This thing had an opening about 3 feet in diameter, but down about 6 feet it opened out, and it was 8 or 10 feet in diameter and about 7 or 8 feet deep. And that's the way they dug them, and it was lined with bricks, very pretty articulate, made little thing. Now this was just a dug-out hole, very similar to that shape, and they threw him down in it. But what Reuben was going to do, they were just going to leave him there. Perhaps if Reuben had his way, they weren't going to kill him and throw him in the hole, just throw him in the hole, and then as they fed on, Reuben would work his way back, get the kid out, and send him home. And there was within his heart the intent to do what was right. Now, Paul talked a lot about that in his epistles. We have that same struggle within us, that we are children of God, we're saved. Bill talks about that a lot on Sunday mornings. Isn't it great to be a child of God, to be saved? And it certainly is. But we still struggle with this human nature. We still struggle with thoughts that are not correct, with sin that we do overtly, and sin that we commit without doing what we should do. There's that battle going on. And that's what Reuben is facing. But he's trying to do what's right. He's trying to do what's right. And we need to try to do what's right. We need to ask God's Holy Spirit to lead us and guide us with our thoughts, with our actions, with what we say, so that we present to the world Christ as he should be presented, and not a hypocritical life that turns people away. So it came to pass, verse 23 says, when Joseph had come to his brothers, that they stripped him of his tunic, the tunic of many colors that was on him, and they took him and cast him into a pit. Now that doing that was an indication of how much that tunic meant to them. It was an affront to them, and they desired it to be gone. They just desired it to be gone. They took him and threw him in the pit. The pit was empty, there was no water in it, so he's not about to drown, he's just down there in that pit. Now look what they did. You talk about men with very little conscience. They just sat down and had a meal. I find that amazing. amazing. This brother of theirs is over here in this pit, obviously hungry and thirsty. And they probably were not gentle with him when he tossed him down in there. And they're going to sit down and have a meal. Can you imagine him calling for water and maybe something to eat? They're just laughing and having a big time. These men hated him. And now look what happens. You remember those little cartoons where the light bulb would go off? Somebody's head. You remember that little cloud up here? Ding! Here's a light bulb going on. They looked up, and here comes a company of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels bearing spices, balm, and myrrh on their way to carry them down to Egypt. So Judah said, now this is Reuben's full brother. Now think about this. There was Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and fourth born was Judah. What tribe did Christ come from? The tribe of Judah. Look at this coming from Judah. What profit is there if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Now he's thinking about, there might be some money in this for us. He's thinking two things. There could be some money in this for us, plus if we don't kill him and we do what they're about to do, in one way we're innocent because we don't know what's going to happen to him. We really don't. We just don't know at all. Did you ever have a stray dog or a stray cat come up to your house and you ran off, you hollered and screamed and threw rocks at them and everything, and they left, and you said, "Glad they're gone." You ever wonder what happened to them? Did they live a happy life? Did they find someone, or did they get hit by a car and run over? Well, see, it's not your responsibility anymore. And so that's what this is what Judah's going to bring up. What profit is there to kill him and conceal his blood? Come and let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not their hand be upon him, our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh. So now Reuben has brought this thing up to try to find a way to get him out of the pit and take him back to father. And now Judah comes up with this other idea, and this is going to thwart Reuben's plan because they're going to gather around and do something with him. But in one way or the other, both these brothers are trying to do in their own way something that will not cause them to be condemned in the eyes of their father. And they listened. His other brothers listened. When we read the Bible, we read phrases like that. Sometimes we just fly over them. But it's very important when people listen to an idea. Sometimes something is said that brings up a thought process in their mind that they hadn't thought of. And they can be positively or negatively influenced by that. Now, there's some things that you're never going to change my mind on. Absolutely not. And you're the same way, aren't you? No more, you can argue about it from now, it's not going to change my mind. But there's some things that I don't know that you could probably tell me that I think, is that right? I didn't know that. How many of y'all have ever been shown something on your silly phone that you didn't know you could do? And you think, oh, I didn't know that. Sure, we do. See there? So some things you can be made aware of that will cause you to think some other difference. And so God's Word says here they listened. They listened. Now this is a serious thing they're about to do. Do you ever wonder why in verse 28 he mentions Midianite traders passed by, and yet they were sold to Ishmaelites, and he mentioned the Ishmaelites first of all? Well, who were Ishmaelites? They were the descendants of Ishmael, and it's only been a couple of generations back when Ishmael was still with his father Abraham. He was a half-brother to Isaac, and Isaac was Jacob's father. So there's only been a couple of generations, but they already have a place where they live, and they already have tribal stuff going on, and they're not really worshipers of God. And this is an important point I want to mention before we finish this chapter. If God's people had stayed in Canaan and not gone to Egypt, we already have seen from the previous chapter, and we're going to see in the next chapter, 38, next week, that they were in danger of assimilating into that culture. And if they had not gone down to Egypt, they would have probably just melded into that culture and disappeared. And that is a vitally important thing. And one thing we have to be so cautious and so careful of in our world today is that we don't become so much like the world that no one can tell we're a Christian when we're out there in the world. By the way we speak, the way we act, the way we live. Are you living in such a way that people will have no doubt once they get to know you that you're a child of God? And are you living in such a way that the way you look and act will decry the fact that you claim to be a Christian? That's very, very important. Very important. That's a good place for a sermon, by the way. So anyway, the Midianite traders, these are the same ones. Who was Midian? He was the child, a son of Abraham after Sarah died. You remember he married Keturah? And Midian was one of their sons. And he was not an upstanding citizen either. Both these boys had married Canaanite women. And they had gone the dark way. And so these are relatives of each other. They live together. They venture around together. They're in business together. So Midianite traders and Ishmaelite traders can be the same ilk when it comes to what they were about to do. So the brothers pulled Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. That is the price of a slave, I am told, in that day and age. 20 shekels of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. Now, that last little phrase is very quickly done. When we get to chapter 39, we'll find him there. But that was a mighty big trip, and I'm sure they didn't treat him like a princely king on the way down there. I have a vision in my mind of him being bound and maybe walking behind a camel, struggling along, and I'm sure they didn't give him the best of food and most of water and everything. So this was a tough trip for him, a long, long trip, probably 2 to 3 more weeks of travel. Now, verse 29, Reuben returned to the pit, and indeed Joseph was not in the pit. See, apparently Reuben had went out with a flock or something. He didn't know what they'd done this time, and so he tore his clothes. Of course, we've seen that 100 times. That was a Hebrew way of, well, any of those people, of showing tremendous grief and agony. They just tear their clothes. And he returned to his brothers, and he said, "The Lord is no more, and where shall I go?" Why? Because he was elder brother. And he had a responsibility toward this 17-year-old boy. So they took Joseph's tunic, killed a kid of the goats, and dipped the tunic in the blood. They sent the tunic of many colors, and they brought it to their father and said, "We found this. Do you know whether it's your son's tunic or not?" What a stupid question. There was only one of those, and Jacob had it made for this boy. There is no doubt in anybody's mind whose this is. But these boys are trying to be really cute and coy. And, "Oh, do you have any idea whose this could be? We just found it. It has blood all over it." He recognized it and he said, "It's my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Without doubt, Joseph is torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put sackcloth on his waist. This is another symbol of mourning. Sackcloth was like, very similar to what we call a toe sack, an old burlap bag. It is not something you want on your skin. And he put that around his waist, and he mourned for his son many days. Now, there's something interesting about this before we finish the chapter. If you believe something that is not true, and yet you believe it, it is true to you, and you may be dead wrong about it, but in your mind you know it's true. Let me give you a simple example to make you laugh a little bit. Any of y'all have a kitty cat in the house that you'd admit? Yeah, I like kitty cats. I really do. I've got a precious cat. But now, my cat, now she lives in my shop. She's a Marble Kitty. But I brush her every day. She's the sweetest thing. She loves to be brushed. But as I brush that cat, hair just goes everywhere. I mean, it's just good grief. But I think the world of a cat. But years ago, I was talking to a lady. This lady was listening to me talk to someone else about kitty cats in the shed and everything, because I've almost always had a cat in the shed, in the barn, in the shop. And this lady said, well, I have 3 cats in my house, and they never shed a hair. And I looked at her like, what you talking about? Now, I entered into a conversation with her about that, and you know, she truly believed that. I don't know whether she was almost blind or whether she had a superior vacuum cleaner or what. But I said, you have 3 cats in your house and they never shed? No, my cats don't shed. Hairless cats. Now, in her mind, my point to tell you that in her mind, I seriously think she believed it. And so, in her mind, it was the truth. But you and I know it was not the truth. You got a kitty cat in your house and you hold on to him and leave, your sweater's going to be the color of that kitty cat. And shed like everything. But the point is, the boy was not dead. He was in the center of God's plan. By the time they brought this back to him, he was probably already in Egypt. A couple, 3 weeks probably had passed. But he was not dead, but Jacob considered him dead. To Jacob, he was gone. He was dead. I've heard stories, especially from World War II, where soldiers would be listed as missing in action, and the telegram would be sent to their parents at home and said, during this kind of engagement in this place, your son has not been found, and we consider him missing in action. They didn't say he was dead, but they said he was missing in action. And then later on, maybe they would find some remains a week or 2 after the battle, and then they would send a telegram in and say, we have discovered that your son was killed in action. And I've heard stories like this where a mother would say, no, he's not. He's not dead. He's not dead. And you know, when the war was over, the boy came home. It was somebody else. The dog tags had been pulled off of both or 3 of them, 4 of them. He was injured, but he survived and he was alive. And his mom said, I knew he wasn't dead. I knew he wasn't dead. I knew he was coming home. And on the other hand, there have been parents that said, oh, he's alive, he's coming home, when he truly was, and there was no way he was coming home. Jacob thought the boy was dead, but he wasn't. So to him, and this is very important for the rest of the story that we're going to start reading in chapter 39, the rest of the story is important for us to know and understand that in Jacob's mind, he now has 11 sons. One is gone, and it's his favorite son. He is dead. And look at verse 35. We'll close here in just a moment. And all his sons and all of his daughters arose to comfort him. Do you see the hypocrisy of that? Now, I don't know how many other children he had. These 11 are the ones that were mentioned. They became the 12 tribes of Israel, along with Joseph's sons that we'll see later on. And it says daughters, so he had more than just Dinah, perhaps from other concubines or whatever, but they all arose and comforted him. Isn't it a little bit hypocritical for these boys that caused this to be comforting their dad over his dreaming over his son? And he said, I shall go down into my grave to my son in mourning. Thus the father wept for him. In other words, my mourning will never be over until I die. Now the Midianites, verse 36, this is the final verse we'll read tonight, and this verse sets us up for chapter 39. When they got down there, they sold him in Egypt to a fellow named Potiphar. Potiphar was an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard, so he's way up the food chain. And as God would have it, he gets sold to this man, rather than sold to someone to work in a mine or work with crops or cattle or whatever. He's sold to a man where he has a good placement, a good job to do, and we'll see that. Now we're going to close here, and because there's no way to start chapter 38 with just a few minutes left. Chapter 38 is very much like the chapter before this one. And it's a huge diversion from this story, but it is also important because it shows you, it gives you some insight into the heart of these people that we're talking about, these sons especially. This is one of the most despicable things that you could ever come up with in chapter 38. We're going to look at that next week. The story of Judah and Tamar. And it's hard to even read about and look at it, but it's very interesting. Not a very long chapter. We'll look at it next week. But you go ahead and read forward to that chapter, and if you've never read it before, or if it's been a while since you've read through the Bible, or since you've read this chapter, once you read it, if you'll just sit down and read through it. And by the way, let me mention that before I finish my statement. One good way, and I study the Bible, but you know one good way to do it is just sit down and read it. Just read it. Just sit down and read this chapter and try to not go and look at other scriptures from your center or side reference. Just read it. And then read it again. And then you can begin to study it verse by verse if you want to. But if you'll just read this story, you're going to think, what in the world were they thinking? What were they doing? And we're going to look at all the moral implications of that when we study again next week, chapter 38. And then in chapter 39, and from then to the end of the book, we're going to be down in Egypt with Joseph. All right, let's have our prayer time together. Pastor is down at